New York, Brooklyn, 1973. A man spat in Frank Lucas's face in front of 40 people. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. He really spat hard in front of drug dealers, corner bosses, middlemen, and 3 corrupt cops who pretended not to see. And Frank Lucas did absolutely nothing. He stood still, wiped his face with his handkerchief, put the handkerchief back in his pocket, and left. 14 days later, Carmine Galante's entire family in Brooklyn simply ceased to exist. No declared war, no shootout, no body found on the sidewalk, just silence. The kind of silence that's more terrifying than any explosion. But let's start at the beginning. The place is called Sunset Park, a warehouse in South Brooklyn that serves as a neutral meeting point. The kind of spot where different families settle disputes without either side having to invade the other's territory. Peeling concrete walls, the smell of old oil and metal, a long table in the center with mismatched chairs. Cold fluorescent light that makes everyone look a little guiltier than they are. The meeting was called by intermediaries. Growing tension between Frank Lucas's operation in Harlem and the Bonanno family's expanding interest northward into Manhattan. Overlapping territory, contested customers, money disappearing at the points of contact between the two worlds. The kind of problem that, if not resolved at a table, gets resolved another way, and the other way costs a lot more. Frank arrives with 4 men. On time. Dark gray suit, no hat this time, the air of a man who came to resolve things and leave. Carmine Galante is already there, at the head of the table that belongs to no one but which he has clearly decided is his. 7 men beside him, lit cigar, the same reptilian energy under the sun. Eyes that don't blink. The meeting starts technically well. Numbers are presented. Territories are discussed. There's a language of negotiation being used, an attempt to appear civilized in a context that has nothing civilized about it. Frank speaks with precision, without emotion, with the data he prepared, the proposals he worked out, the kind of presentation that shows he came to work. Galante listens, or pretends to listen, because at a certain point, without warning, without build-up, without any identifiable trigger, he gets up from his chair. He walks over to Frank, stops less than a meter away, and spits, hard, direct, in the face. The sound is dry and final, like a door slamming. The silence that follows is deafening. 40 people in the room and not a sound. No one breathes loud enough to be heard. Galante's men look like they've seen this movie before and know not to move. Frank's men freeze, waiting for a signal that doesn't come. Galante speaks in a low voice, but calculated so everyone can hear. You don't negotiate with me, you obey. Learn the difference. He goes back to his chair, sits, picks up his cigar again as if he'd only stood up to fetch something. Frank Lucas doesn't move for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that feel like 10 minutes to everyone in the room. Then, with a slowness that is itself a statement, he takes the handkerchief from his pocket, wipes his face, carefully, without hurry, folds the handkerchief, puts it back in his pocket, looks at Galante for another 2 seconds with no expression on his face at all, and stands up. The meeting is over. He leaves with his 4 men, without rushing, without another word. The news reaches Harlem before Frank does, because it always arrives first. Someone in the room had an interest in spreading it. There always is. In environments like this, the humiliation of a powerful man is currency. It's worth telling, worth amplifying, worth reaching the right ears to weaken positions, shake alliances, make suppliers reconsider who they do business with. When Frank enters Harlem that night, the neighborhood already knows. Not all the details, but the essential. That Galante spat. That Frank wiped it off and left. That there was no response. And in the world where Frank operates, the standard interpretation is one and the same. Weakness. His own men say nothing in front of him, but Frank has enough years on the street to know how to read what isn't said. The posture that shifts slightly when he enters a room. The extra half-second delay before someone answers when he speaks. The glances that dart away too quickly. Small signals, but Frank Lucas built an empire by reading small signals. He reads them all, and he does nothing. He doesn't call an emergency meeting. He doesn't make a speech to his people. He doesn't send a message to Galante. He doesn't leak any threat through the channels where threats usually leak. He goes home, sleeps, wakes up the next day and operates normally. What is happening beneath the surface no one sees. Frank Lucas had a characteristic that most people around him never fully understood, because it seemed contradictory in a man from his world. He was extraordinarily patient when rage would have been more expected, and extraordinarily cold when heat would have seemed more natural. Not because he didn't feel, but because he had learned very early that showing emotion is handing over vulnerability on a platter. What Galante did in that warehouse wasn't just a humiliation, it was an intelligence test. A provocation designed to make Frank react immediately, visibly, emotionally, in a way that would justify a disproportionate response from the Bonanno family and position Frank as the aggressor in a war that Galante had already planned and was already prepared for. Frank didn't react because he understood the test. And because he understood the test, he had time to do something far more interesting than respond. In the first 3 days, Frank mapped. Not personally, never personally. Through people with no visible connection to him. He identified every point of operation of the Bonanno family in Brooklyn. Not the ones everyone knew, the ones the family thought only they knew. Apartments used as stash houses, front businesses where money was laundered, bars where the captains met on Thursday nights, the names of the accountants, the names of the wives, the names of the schools where the children studied. Not to use them as targets, but because knowing all this meant being able to move with surgical precision instead of brute force. On days 4, 5, and 6, Frank made calls. Not to obvious allies, to people who had their own reasons for wanting the Bonanno family weakened in Brooklyn. Other families that had ceded territory under pressure. Middlemen who had lost business to Galante's expansionist tactics. Men who had scores to settle that had nothing to do with Frank Lucas, but that converged very conveniently with what Frank needed. Frank didn't ask for favors. Frank offered information. Specific, verifiable, and immediately useful information to each person he spoke with. And in exchange, he received only one thing from each. Silent cooperation at a specific moment yet to be determined. On the 7th day, Frank found the pressure point he was looking for. Every empire has one. A place where the structure is thinner than it appears from the outside. In the case of the Bonanno family in Brooklyn in 1973, that point was a single middleman. A man known only by the nickname Dente, who managed the distribution logistics for 7 of the 9 main points in Galante's operation in the borough. Dente wasn't a captain. He had no status, no formal protection. He was just the man who knew where everything was and how everything moved. The kind of person empires depend on completely and never adequately protect, because they never imagine someone from outside will know of his existence. Frank knew, because Frank always mapped the invisible people before the visible ones. Dente received a visit on the 8th day, not from Frank, from a man Dente had never seen before and would never see again. The message was simple. His activities would be delivered to the FBI anonymously and fully documented in exactly 6 days, unless he simply stopped showing up for work. No violence, no physical threat, just the cold arithmetic of 2 options. One involving federal prison and the other involving voluntarily disappearing from a situation that had become too dangerous. Dente chose the second option the same day. With Dente gone, Galante's operation logistics in Brooklyn began to seize up. Silently, because logistical failures don't appear immediately. They show up in the following days when deliveries don't arrive on time, when points run out of product, when money starts circulating irregularly because the chain that kept everything synchronized simply stopped functioning. On days 9, 10, and 11, the consequences of that logistical failure began to create pressure among Galante's own men. Captains who weren't receiving product questioned other captains. Money that didn't arrive created internal suspicion. In criminal organizations, unexplained logistical failure immediately raises the most dangerous question of all. Is someone inside sabotaging or stealing? Once that question takes root, it's almost impossible to remove without conclusive evidence because the environment is built on permanent distrust. Frank didn't need to do anything more in the following days. He just let the Bonanno family's internal distrust work on its own. On the 13th day, 2 of Galante's main captains in Brooklyn, operating under growing paranoia that there was an internal traitor, made unilateral decisions that compromised entire operations. Money was moved irregularly. Meetings were canceled. Local alliances went unanswered. The connective tissue that kept the operation running began to unravel not from external pressure, but from the internal response to the void that a single invisible man had left. On the 14th day, the Bonanno family's operation in Brooklyn hadn't exploded. There was no war, no headline, Just silence. Closed points, men who didn't show up, money that didn't circulate. A structure that had taken years to build simply stopped working, like an engine that loses a part too small to be noticed but too big to be ignored. Galante took weeks to fully understand what had happened, and when he did, there was nothing to attack. No visible move from Frank, no statement, no action that could be responded to. Just the consequences of a chain that had begun with a man named Dente, who decided his freedom was worth more than loyalty to a family that had never truly protected him. Frank Lucas never publicly acknowledged any connection to any of this. He continued operating in Harlem, continued wearing suits and hats, continued being Frank Lucas. And if anyone dared mention the warehouse incident, Frank looked at them with an expression of someone who genuinely doesn't understand the relevance of what's being said. Because for Frank, the warehouse incident hadn't been a humiliation. It had been a lesson. Galante had shown in that moment that he needed an audience to feel powerful. That the act of spitting had been for the 40 watching, not for Frank. That the real goal was to make Frank react in front of those 40 people in a way Galante could use. The saliva on the face had been bait, carefully prepared. Galante was too old and too experienced to do something like that on impulse. Frank had recognized the bait the moment the handkerchief touched his face, and he had chosen not to bite. Here is what most people will never understand about this kind of situation. When someone uses an audience as a weapon against you, the reaction they want is always immediate and visible. Because an immediate and visible reaction happens on their turf, in their time, according to the rules they set. It's always a trap. Public humiliation is rarely about the humiliation itself. It's about forcing a response that can be used. The only way out of the trap is to refuse the adversary's time and create your own. 14 days. One invisible man named Dente. Internal distrust sown without leaving a fingerprint. An entire operation dismantled without a single gun being drawn, without a single threat being spoken aloud, without Frank Lucas's name appearing anywhere in the process. This is what happens when you stop trying to look powerful for an audience and start working for real in the shadows where real power has always been built. Galante's saliva on Frank Lucas's face lasted 30 seconds. The consequences of Frank's silence lasted years. And the lesson that remains is the hardest of all because it goes against everything instinct tells you to do. When they humiliate you in front of everyone, the victory isn't in responding to the audience. The victory is in leaving the room, closing the door, and starting to work where no one is looking. Because the work done in silence is always the work that lasts.